Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Africa podcast, where we get behind the news from the continent. I'm Anne-Marie Besada. Our weekly podcast is brought to you by the Africa Report magazine, which you can always check out online at theafricareport.com. January 25th, 2020 marks the 10-year anniversary of Egypt's revolution in 2011. It put in motion an end to the 29-year rule of Hosni Mubarak. After Tunisia's revolution, Egypt was one of the next countries to see millions of people of all ages, but mainly youth, take to the streets despite pushback from authorities. In the case of Egypt, it was remarkable to see how the revolution unfolded in real time on social media and how protesters remained motivated and organized via those same platforms. While the end of Mubarak opened the imagination to a new type of country, instead the world saw the first democratic elections elect an Islamist president who was later ousted, due to popular demand, by a textbook military coup headed by Field Marshal Abdelfattah al-Sisi. He has remained head of the country ever since. But what drove people to the streets 10 years ago? And how did they envision their new country? In this podcast, we'll try to answer those questions by speaking to three Egyptians who all participated in the revolution and have their own story to tell. Joining me are three guests. We'll start with our first one. Currently living in the United States, we have Egyptian journalist Mohamed Abdelfattah, who was awarded the International Press Freedom Award by the Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression for his work during the revolution. Next, we have Amira, who did not participate in the first round of the revolution, leading to Mubarak's ousting, mainly out of sheer disbelief, but we'll get to that later. But she did become politically active after Mubarak left and helped to establish the Social Democratic Party. She's currently a financial analyst living in Europe, but goes back to Egypt often. And lastly, we have Nadia Idle. She's a writer and activist from London and Cairo. Following the revolution, she edited Tweets from Tahrir, a book which tells the story of the Egyptian uprising in tweets, published in March 2011. She is currently co-host of the left-wing politics, culture, and music podcast, #ACFM on Novara Media, and is working on her first full-length novel. So a warm welcome to all of you. I want to start with you, Mohammed, because you did play a key role towards the end of 2010 by showing the world why Egyptians were fed up with the Mubarak regime through your blogging and investigative reporting on Khalid Said and also on Ahmed Shaban. Why did you want to showcase this, knowing the possible repercussions?
Yeah, it really brings up a lot of emotions that you mentioned, those two particular cases that I worked on in the lead up to the uprising in 2010. And that was really around the time when I first started doing journalism, and I think both of those stories, Khalid Said and Ahmed Shaban, ironically both of them in Alexandria, really exemplify how police brutality and violations by the police really drove a lot of the grievances that a lot of people were feeling in the lead up to the January 25th revolution. And ironically enough, actually, formally back then, January 25th was supposed to be a day of just protest against police brutality. And some of the demands, as far as I remember, were just, we need to change the Minister of the Interior, who runs the police, and a couple of other like social justice-oriented demands. There was no talk whatsoever of actually asking Mubarak to go. That only evolved later on very quickly as people started pouring into the streets. But I do remember those days vividly, and how, especially the case of Khalid Said early on, actually animated and motivated a particular part of the Egyptian middle class who were not politicized, who were not politically active, to come out on the streets and protest symbolically and peacefully, along the Corniche of Alexandria, all wearing black, giving their backs to the cars and looking towards the sea in silence, for an hour or so, and then going away. That was a new form of activism that no one expected, especially the traditional political activists back then. And in a huge part, that was organized by activism on social media back then, just around this particular theme. And of course, these stories, among so many others, almost in the decade prior to the uprising, just added fuel to the mix in terms of what happened during the 18 days, early 2011.
Now, we'll go to Nadia. You were living in London then, but clearly you were watching what was happening in Egypt, where you grew up, actually. So what was it that pushed you to hop on a plane and be a part of the action?
Just listening to Mohammed there, it's bringing back a lot of memories for me. So thanks, Emery, for inviting me on to talk about this. So I think the context for me is important. I need to give you a little bit of a backstory to explain what got me to jump on that plane, which is that I started getting politicized as I left university in Egypt in 2001, let's say. And I think there were two reasons. There's many reasons, I think, but there's two reasons why I left Egypt for the UK, which is also a country that I was familiar with. I had links here, etc. But I left because I started getting politicized, and I didn't feel like Egypt was somewhere where I could get involved. I didn't know anyone involved in politics, and it didn't feel like the sort of environment where I could get involved in activism. Doesn't mean that it wasn't, but I didn't feel like it was at the time when I was 20. And the other really big reason was because of street harassment of women. I didn't feel like it was possible for me to walk in the street in Egypt and be a person. I'm a very public person. I like being on the streets. I like being on public transport. I like feeling part of the city, and I really didn't. And that was having a big effect on me as a teenager and in my early 20s. So the reason I'm saying all of that is because when I moved to the UK, I got very, very heavily involved in politics and basically started doing, working for a radical left-wing NGO, and started working in politics in the UK, very involved in the movement against the Iraq war and Afghanistan and other things. So by the time we get to 2011, I'm part organizing this big activist conference. All of this stuff is happening. I'm very well linked in politics. And then I distinctly remember visiting family in Beirut I think it was January, when the situation in Tunis started to take shape. And I didn't really let it register. It didn't register at that point that anything was going to happen in Egypt. By the time I got to London and the 25th of January happened, I was just absolutely transfixed with what was going on. Media started being shut out in Egypt. I started watching everything on Twitter. I'm not a big tweeter, but I started watching everything on Twitter and basically pictures from Al Jazeera. So we had the story from Twitter and pictures from Al Jazeera. And I started to realize that Twitter was being used as a way of not so much organizing, although it was in a way, but mostly broadcast, getting the information out there to the world. So all of that is the backstory, but I remember distinctly sitting at my desk in my office in London, being someone who, is totally bought into global social movements, to knowledge about moments in history, and saying, I can't not go. I can't not take this chance. I don't care, I'm almost shaking saying this now, but I don't care how dangerous it is, even though I'm quite risk averse as a person. I thought, I have one chance to be part of something. This is one chance. So I literally, as we say in the introduction to the book, I sent an email to my boss and I said, look, I need to go now. And I had a couple of other Egyptian friends who had already left. And I made a bucket list. I made a list of things that I wanted to do before I went and things I wanted to say to people, because I didn't know if I was going to come back in one piece. I'm being honest with you. But to answer your question in short, I think it was that. It was, I have such strong feelings and emotions about Egypt. I definitely and still have a complicated emotional love-hate relationship with the country. And being someone who's so involved in activism, it just felt impossible for me not to go. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that in some capacity, I just had to be there. So I got on that plane, and when I landed, I deliberately did not go to my family house. I just went straight to Tahrir. So, yeah, that's the long version.
Okay. Now, Amira, you were living your life in Egypt. You had just come back after studying abroad. So you were there, but you were there in a different kind of frame of mind than the other two. What were you seeing? What were you thinking?
I couldn't understand how this happened. It started with the 25th, of course, and the 25th was a shocker to everybody because, first of all, everybody was a lot of people were on the street that day, which has never happened in the life of anybody that we know. I don't think anybody has experienced that ever in Egypt that's alive today. So that was the biggest shock of my life. And I thought, this is not normal. This is not for real. So I waited for the 28th until Friday came. And then that day, I think that was the turning point. Friday was a big turning point because they shut everybody out. And that's what got people mad. By shutting them out, by closing the internet, by basically closing everything to anybody, people really got angry. And that was one of their biggest mistakes. And that's where I actually didn't go to the streets at all until the 11th of Feb. I didn't at all participate in the first revolution because I still didn't understand it. There wasn't one figure. There wasn't demands, except later on when they started talking about removing Mubarak. I think it was really meant for Habib al-Adli. He deserved it though, but it wasn't really meant for anything else. So I was confused. I didn't understand anything what was going on. Nobody really had anything to say. It was just people on the street. So I waited it out and waited to see what was going to happen, to see what my next step was going to be.
Now, going back to you, Mohammed, you were kind of in the thick of it. What were you seeing? What were you feeling? What were people commenting? Because in a way, I wouldn't say it all came back to you. It's not that, but you kind of exposed something that a lot of us outside the country had heard about, but we didn't really know. Were people saying things to you?
I mean, I think we were just part of a new generation of younger Egyptian journalists who were somehow democracy-minded, human rights-minded. The overarching goal of our journalism is to talk about things that are not allowed to be talked about. One of the glaring examples where you can't broadcast or mention any chant against Mubarak by name, for example. That was such a taboo. Us being able to produce stories or videos that just show that soundbite was revolutionary, if you can imagine. Of course, talking about stories related to police brutality or other human rights violations, like these were things that were unheard of. I mean, I knew colleagues who did not belong to that group of people, but like traditionally, journalism sometimes was seen in Egypt as a conduit to other careers. Like people want to get famous or they want to get connected to high-profile individuals and switch careers to some high-paying job down the line. Very few were intentionally looking at journalism as a way to push society forward. And I think I'm glad I was part of that trend or part of that group. Covering stories that the regime doesn't want you to cover. It made me sort of feel a very strong sense of purpose. It made me feel a very strong sense of purpose in Alexandria, January 25th, when I saw pictures of Khaled Said and Ahmad Shaban being carried by demonstrators, among so many other cases too. None of these stories or none of these singular events were the only motivation for what happened. It was a very long-running layers of grievances, economic, social. The police was just, the police was just a symptom of government crackdown, of government inefficiency, of government corruption. The police in Egypt, every police station in every neighborhood in Egypt is actually the number one touch point with which everyday Egyptians regularly interact. And if they're repressive, that means that the overall regime is repressive. And that's why on January 28th, we had this exceptional phenomena of people swarming police stations all around the country and burning them down. Not that anyone would condone whatever, that's not my point, but why did the overwhelming majority of Egyptians decide to go to police stations on January 28th? They didn't go to the building of the Ministry of Supplies and Oil and Rice, and what they went to what they've always seen as the frontal representative of the government. I think one other thread I would like to pick up on that Nadia mentioned, and probably Amira in certain ways, the overwhelming emotions that really, how do I phrase this? This overwhelming emotion of being part of such a historic event that our generation has not seen, nor expected. No one had any expectation for this uprising to be huge. No one could anticipate that. Just like how Nadia submitted her resignation or said, I can't get back now, I was also working as a reporter for Ahram Online in Alexandria. I'm supposed to be in Alexandria, and I decided to just leave and go to Cairo just to be in Tahrir Square physically as a private citizen. And I know many people who did that too, because we were feeling, I'm not here just to report on this. I have to participate too, because this is my own country. And down the line, I need to feel that, I played a role, or I was there, or there's something, magical is going on. So there were definitely a lot of emotions back then.
Nadia, after you arrived and you saw sort of, as Mohammed is explaining, everyone kind of going as a crowd mentality into Tahrir around the streets in Cairo, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? Like, what were people asking for even? So I had never seen anything like this before. I have found it really difficult to participate in social life beyond, the groups of people that you grew up with and went to school with and university with. I didn't know how to, especially as a woman in Egypt. And like I said, I was in London, having been 10 years of participating in huge demonstrations. So I had this kind of background, and then suddenly I get to Egypt and the same thing is happening, or not just the same, like times 1,000. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I went to university in Tahrir, right? I went to the American University in Cairo and Tahrir for 5 years. And then suddenly this entire space is transformed. And for me, there were two things. So I'll answer your second question first. So the second question is, what were people demanding? By the time I got there, which was on the 7th, by that point, what was really strong was the Aish Hurriya Adala Ijtimaiya chant, which is like bread, freedom, social justice, or social equality, which is so strong and so poignant and symbolic and real and non-symbolic. And I think it was such a strong chant because it signified the simplicity almost of basically what people were demanding. There was the other chant, which was for the 4 demands, which I can't remember off the top of my head. One of them being that Mubarak resigned, which did come later. Maybe it was there at that point. But I think for me, what really touched me was the fact that what we're talking about is people just want enough food to eat, and people don't want to be, as Mohammed said, like be
taken into police stations and beaten up and being on the receiving end of so much oppression and brutality. And we want some kind of social fairness. I mean, it was just so strong. And in Arabic, it just felt like such a clean chant, you know. And I've been used to for years being in England and, you know, arguing about what the chant should be on the street. And of course, the Egyptians did it so well. And I mean, and I've never been so proud of how good Egyptians were at making up chants and stuff, because obviously, as everyone knows, the Egyptians are the funniest people in the Middle East. And I will take that, I'll make that strong argument wherever I go. But the other thing that was happening in the square was, following on from that, the sense of humor, like the sense of humor that people came up with. I remember seeing there was a school teacher who would put up a massive board teaching, like, as in, it was basically like a show. He was teaching just pretend teaching passers-by. It was actually a show, the alphabet, but it wasn't the alphabet. It spelled out, you know, imshi ahmar, like leave us donkey or whatever, talking about Mubarak. And there was so much creative, funny stuff that was happening, which was also sending a strong message. But so that's kind of some of the things that I've heard, and I'm sure as we'll talk, I'll remember some others. But the main thing that struck me, and I will never forget this, was how different it was to be in a crowd as a woman in Cairo. I had, and you know, I think every other woman in Cairo had experienced harassment for being female, both verbal and, you know, physical, for many people, like day in and day out, just for being a woman on the street. And suddenly, in the whatever it was, the 5-6 days that I was there, I was in a crowd with men, and there was no harassment whatsoever. So that's my experience and the experience of people that I talk to. And for me, that meant that for the first time, I felt like a person, not a woman, not a female. I felt like a person, and I felt like an Egyptian. And that is one of the most profound experiences that I have ever had, because I was able to participate with my fellow Egyptians in this huge surge of political movement on the street. And I wasn't self-conscious, and I'm not looking around me to see who's, you know, going to touch me or come near me or harass me. And it's such a big deal, because life in Egypt, especially in Cairo, is completely different if you're a woman than a man on the street. Men have their own kind of harassment from authorities, obviously, which women don't get. But on a personal level, I was just there as a political actor. And also, to some extent, I think class seemed to be less important. Again, we were just people, and we're all there. And as I think we've already mentioned, droves of people flew from abroad. And I was one of them. So yeah.
We'll just give Amira a chance to come in. So you, at this point, I know you still haven't quite physically come into this first round of the protests, but how are you viewing all this? Because, like you mentioned earlier, for a generation, you know, since those who were in the 1952 revolution, never has so many people really come out to the streets in that kind of, I would say, uniform and that kind of coexistence. So were you picking up on this? Were you thinking, okay, maybe I do want to go in, maybe there's something here that we could actually tap into?
I only thought of going in. I knew that eventually something was going to change. Eventually, either Mubarak was going to leave or some kind of demand was going to be met, and hence we were going to move forward. I was waiting to see what the next step was going to be, and eventually it was Mubarak leaving, and I knew there was going to be a big political void. The dismantling of his party, etc. That void, that political void, had to be met, had to be filled. Otherwise, we weren't going to go very far. And that's when I started looking through different political parties, what each one wanted, what each one sided for, because a lot of them started doing little conferences here and there to at least have the 5,000 signatures to be able to create a party. And that took a lot of time. The time between the 11th of Feb and all the way to, let's say, the summer, there was too much turmoil. We still went back to Tahrir on Fridays, by the way, after the 11th of Feb to continue to make sure that the demands were, some kind of demand was being met. Now, we still continue doing a lot of things on the streets, maybe at a lesser level. So we'd all meet on Fridays in Tahrir, and then I think that I would the way Nadia is describing what her experience was in Tahrir is exactly what I had experienced at the times after that. So anytime after the 11th of Feb.
I'll just jump in for a second. So, because you've all sort of mentioned the demands. What were the demands? Because like Mohammed said at the beginning, there were no concrete demands. People were just upset and they kind of expressed that anger. But now we have demands. What did people want? What were they able to finally verbalize? Apart from, yes, we want food, but you don't go on the street for days in, days out like that. Something must have been materializing.
I think the implicit demand was the correct transition, because they could have easily ousted Mubarak, and I think a lot of people wanted. I think a year before he left, there was talk about him leaving, so people eventually knew that was going to happen, and that wasn't the main problem. It was basically a smooth transition towards I would say, I can't say to a better democracy, but I would say to something that would create this social justice. Which did not exist and probably isn't to a certain extent today. But I think that's what they need. They want to make sure that transition, that new world they wanted, it would exist going forward, which a lot of people had a little taste of during that time. We did have, when you went to Tahrir, you did feel that there wasn't this social divide. Everybody talked to everybody. When you met people on the street, all my friends became all the people I didn't ever talk to before, like people from Mataraya, for example, people from all parts of the country that did not come from my circle. And that's what people wanted. They wanted just to be able to have that chance to live a normal life. And I think that, I don't know what the other people.
I see Mohammed, he's nodding his head in agreement. So what are you saying to that?
You know, what Amira just mentioned, and what Nadia mentioned earlier about feeling safe in Tahrir just for this period of time, and how all of a sudden, there is no harassment or the social divides are disappearing, and we're able to talk across class in a society that is deeply stratified, that is deeply class conscious, and could be very elitist and harsh in many ways. That disappeared all of a sudden, and people within the square. Or other equivalent squares around Egypt and Alexandria or other places felt all these barriers falling down socially. Not, the politics are doing, politically things are happening here, but socially there are immediate ramifications which were really liberating. One of my personal observations, I remember, I used to love getting full and falafel sandwiches from Filfela in downtown Cairo. And you go inside and everyone is swarming around the cashier or swarming around where you get the sandwiches from. That was before the uprising, right? I swear, I remember to this day, and I think back then people posted pictures, like immediately after Mubarak stepped down, February 12th onwards, people were just lining up in queues on their own, And I think, there's no traffic police on the streets, and all of a sudden people are volunteering to organize that traffic. And no car is going through a red light, although there's no police around. And I think Egyptians felt a very unique and exceptional sense of justice that had happened back then that so magically just trickled down to their day-to-day behaviors. Obviously these behaviors did not last for long. They were really ephemeral for a few weeks or several months. And then I think when people started feeling that things are not shaping up as well as they thought it was going to be, they started behaving differently again. But these were truly like first-hand magical observations that all of us had back then.
I was just to make a quick comment on that, because, you know, like I agree with you about the feeling, Mohammed, that we talk about it in terms of like this, it was magical, but if anything, this kind of validated this experience, I think for many of us, like validated this, you know, as you mentioned, Mohammed, this kind of like a politics of possibility, of solidarity, of possible, you know, that things are possible and things can change. And for me, you know, that story that you just said about, you know, people suddenly forming queues or, you know, lines outside the falafel place or whatever, it's about hope, and it's about the possibility of believing that you can imagine a different future. And it's also about agency. It's about people feeling that they have some kind of inner strength because of a collective experience which they've had or the country's had, regardless of whether you've participated in it or not. And then you see yourself as an agent of change. So as you walk in the street, or as you are in the line for the falafel, or as in Tahrir, the way people were cleaning up, the whole place was being cleaned up constantly, and people were inventing recycling sort of systems. It was so, you know, creative and innovative. And, you know, we've seen these things happen over history, you know, over, you know, the last, you know, 200, 300 years, or, you know, thousands of years in other places, and they've been documented. But it's a completely different thing to experience it yourself when you see what the feeling of having some kind of power and agency does to people, not just in the point where they're demonstrating, but to everyday life. And my final point on this, which I think is really important, and why I have, you know, I'm an eternal optimist, because I believe that, you know, things hopefully bend towards some kind of justice, even though looking at the world today, it's kind of difficult to believe that. But once you have the experience of being somewhere with your own 2 feet and being there in Tahrir for the thousands of people from all around Egypt and Egyptians from abroad, no one can take that experience away from your physical body. And it lives inside you, and it can be reinvigorated in your later life. So even if 20, 30 years pass, we will all remember what it was like to be there, even if it's kind of at the back of our heads. And I think that is kind of critical for social change.
Can I put this question to all three of you? Could we say that the starts of the protests were a little bit, I know everyone's spoken about this coming together and there were no divisions of class and everything, but was it a bit of an elitist revolution? Were people from the countryside pouring into the big cities? Did we have a sense that everyone was on the same page, or it was just the people in the urban areas who had access to a lot of these, perhaps social media, perhaps not, but more of that urban setting, who were able to identify with what everyone was asking for? Yeah, I mean, I could start, because I always have a very specific anecdote about this divide, if I can, because my father is from the countryside, my mom is from Alexandria, and you know, my father grew up most of his life in Alexandria, and then we would visit as kids, go to the countryside in the Bahira for a week, and then we get back or something, visit a few times a year, and we had some farming land and things like that there, and I still to this day, you know, cousins and still in touch with my entire family on my dad's side until now, and definitely this absolutely felt like an urban phenomenon to them. You know, I remember the first time I went there to visit in 2011, they were talking to me literally as if I'm an other, like, so you guys over there, what's happening with the revolution? And everything in the village is just very quiet, day-to-day business. Nothing is changing. You know, they're farming, they're irrigating, they're going to the school. And at least at the very beginning, they felt that this was an exclusively urban affair, that is really disconnected from them. Again, they would just address me as one of those guys over there who are, you know, doing these things. That's how they would refer to the revolution. And I think it only broke into some of in the countryside, what they call the centers or al-markaz, which is like where the government of
of the city is, or of the governorate is, not the villages on the outskirts. That's where the courts are. Some demonstrations in some of these centers, but none of that touched, went through the villages and the countryside at all. They were watching it on TV for the most part. Nothing in what happened in the revolution affected them, to be honest, either positively or negatively, just to be very fair. And they live in an existence that is largely disconnected from the central government to begin with. They have their own security, they have their own day-to-day life. Of course, their lives could be improved a lot if this revolution succeeded in a big way. But for them, it was kind of like, all right, a blip on my graph, and then it just went away. So that's how I feel about this question, I guess.
Anyone else? Yeah, Nadia?
I was just going to say on that, I think in one sense, when you have big gatherings of people or some kind of uprising in the capital city or the metropolis, wherever it's been, throughout history, I'm sure if you go back to the 19th century, it was same for the Paris Commune, or, whatever big movements, even ones that have managed to hold space. If you are in the villages in a large country, like Mohammed said, it will always seem remote to a certain extent, even if there are loads of people, as there were from Egypt, coming from the countryside at one point. While you're actually outside the center of power, outside the capital city, it will feel far away. I think that's a different question, or a different answer to the question to what you asked, Anne-Marie, about whether it was an elitist revolution. And from my knowledge, I would say that it wasn't, because there were simply so many people involved from different parts of society that every group had its own role. I would say that. So one of the things that we try to explain in the introduction to the book that I edited with Alex Nunn's tweets from Tahrir is that, sure, there were, loads of people on Twitter tweeting in English, the other people tweeting in Arabic as well, both as an organizing tool, but most importantly for broadcast, because most other channels were cut at the time, except for, of course, the 28th, where there was 28th of January, where there was no internet. But there were thousands of young, especially the urban working class, of young men who literally put their bodies on the line, in the front line, in this, in these street battles. And before them, there were the organized working class who had been, in strike, I think in Mahalla and other places, who were refusing to go back to work, which also had an effect. So it wasn't just the stuff that was happening in Tahrir, but even just in Tahrir itself, the vast majority of the people who were putting themselves on the line, who were bringing the sheer numbers, and frankly, who had very little to lose. They had less to lose than people from affluent backgrounds who were doing, the media stuff. That was, the working class, both urban and rural. So it was definitely not an elitist revolution, but the elite were involved in perhaps sections of it, with, of course, the middle class and others as well.
Okay. I wanted to just take it to the point now in February when the first major demand was met, and that was the ousting of Mubarak. And as Amira had mentioned, there was going to be this political void. Did you guys sense this was going to happen, or was this just too much joy that, oh God, he's finally out and we can't really think about what the next step is? Was there a plan B? Was there a plan?
There was no plan. In all honesty, I think I'm going to refer back to the elitist part of the revolution. I think the revolution was a shock to a lot of people. People started joining after the 25th, not during the 25th. The 25th was, oh my God, we can actually do this. And that's what made people go to the streets the days after that, well, starting from the 28th, of course, onwards, especially with the 28th happening, when they felt, hey, why are you guys doing this to us? Why are you cutting us off from the world? So let me go see for myself what's going on really in Tahrir. Is this what's going on? So it's a combination of elitist and not elitist at the same time. It's a combination of a lot of things. But after the 11th of Feb, there was no plan. Nobody had a plan. the plan is actually the 2 years after that. For 2 years, we didn't have a plan. And that's and who was going to have a plan after revolution? Who knows what to do? Is there a standard operating procedure for a revolution, post a revolution? There isn't. And because there was already only one party in place before then, dismantling that party and having nothing else meant that people didn't. Actually, the people expected the government to decide what to do, and that government was no longer existing. People didn't understand what it meant for Mubarak to leave. Nobody knew what that meant. People went onto the streets. We celebrated to the morning, but nobody knew what that meant. What was it? What were we going to do next morning? Nobody knew.
And so, did you guys also have that experience when you were on the streets?
I would say that it's always with the opportunity of hindsight that when we come to analyze these big world events, we think about it as in terms of, was there a plan? But I think Amira's completely right in being able to say, like, this is so unprecedented for Egypt. So I would make the argument that this is the first president or head of state that had been toppled by the Egyptian people in 7,000 years of history. Like, no joke. Okay, so even though there were signs before, the regime was weak, Mubarak had run his good, whatever, the reality of this would not have happened without the thousands of people. It would not have happened in this way if it wasn't for thousands of people participating in grassroots democracy in this way. So of course there wasn't a plan. There couldn't be a plan because things were changing from one day to the other. I mean, it was clear even by looking at the American administration, the US at the time, just their own communications machine was so convoluted because day by day, hour by hour, they didn't know what was going on. Nobody knew what was going on because what was going on was a massive surge of energy on the street from people. So again, to answer your question, now looking back at it, like Amira mentioned in the beginning, having a huge political vacuum like that people are unable to prepare for has huge consequences which Egypt is going to pay for, or at least depending on how you look at it, there are going to be consequences for that, but you can't have a plan for this sort of thing. And for me, personally, I went back to the UK and then I started trying to do some stuff from here, but I didn't know what to do. I was just elated that we were able to do this, and and I think it was a very, very difficult job for people in Egypt, but it's people who were in Egypt at the time who would be able to talk about that. And for me, I wasn't embedded in the society, but I think it was overwhelming in a way where I would love to hear now from activists who were there at the time what they thought was possible with this massive political vacuum, because it's how do you deal with that? I don't think you can.
Well, I think that's a good question. Maybe we can put to both Amira and Mohammed. You guys were there right at the time and in Egypt. So what do you do next? What's the next step?
I mean, I would definitely agree with Amira on, there was no plan, and I think that was a bad thing on February 11th. But we also have to realize, we have to acknowledge or admit in hindsight that on February 11th, when Mubarak stepped down, there was too much euphoria and there was too much happiness and elation and joy that we entirely suspended our rational thinking and ability to think critically about anything. We were too happy to be concerned with anything. And I'm saying this as, partly as a private citizen back then. I was there in Tahrir, between Tahrir and Alexandria, but I was also a reporter. So I wasn't really operationally part of this group of people who were able to move the needle on these things politically. I knew all of them, and I know that no one was thinking about what's happening from a rational point of view. The only two parties in what was happening who were thinking how to take advantage of what's happening were the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian military. And these are the only two forces who were able to be cold-headed enough and to think about elections, referendums, and the mechanisms of power. And it is unfortunate because there is no other force other than the Islamists that were allowed to organize or to have a party or to have any kind of activism during Mubarak. And I think that was intentional engineering of the political scene on the part of Mubarak and his people to tell the outside world, it's me or the Islamists. So if there's a political vacuum, who are the people who know how to run election campaigns? Who are the people who know how to do grassroots work? Who are the people who know how to do communications or public relations or organize demonstrations with a political objective? They were the Muslim Brotherhood. When I was in the University of Alexandria on campus, you had Muslim Brotherhood activists completely allowed to have tables and chairs and organizing committees and all sorts of groups working on things, recruiting students out in the open, like everything is fine, and no one is touching them. The minute an activist who hails from any party other than the Muslim Brotherhood, and it doesn't matter, you're on the right wing economically, the left wing, socialism, capitalism, it doesn't matter to the regime. Any of those guys comes up and talks to students, they're taken away immediately. You're not allowed to distribute flyers. You're not allowed to talk to students. You're not allowed to do any events. And that was on a university campus, which is, I think, is a microcosm for the larger political scene. I think there's a lot of blame to go around for how a lack of plan or a lack of political skill resulted in the failure, if you could say, of the revolution afterwards. The uprising succeeded only so far as, removing Mubarak from power, but it didn't succeed in actually governing or leading or strategizing for a future or a common vision. And there were so many secondary fights that a lot of those political activists were consumed by that totally missed the larger picture. One final point, which I think is really connected to this question of elitism and whether the revolution was led by elitists or whether it was an elitist revolution. I think that the class that was in charge of this uprising, if I could describe it that way, who happened to be political activists or organizers or people who are politically informed, just completely missed the big picture on where the Egyptian public opinion was headed. I believe that the military and the Muslim Brotherhood were really calculating where the public opinion is, where people's sentiment is. And we had a lot of idealism, just insisting on being on the streets all the time. While if you look at state television back then, they were just showing, hey, this is chaos. We need safety again. We need security again, blah, 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 blah. You were not countering that political message at all. You were saying that's the wrong message. We disagree. You're morally inferior to us political activists or something. And you were not engaged with the actual public opinion on the street. And I think that over time mushroomed up until its final conclusion. 1 year after Morsi took power, 2013, with another uprising that then resulted in a popular coup that removed Morsi from power and right now shut down democracy altogether. Because the regime was working in a very methodological, steady way from 2011 up until 2013 to create a new public opinion that would delegitimize this revolution and make people feel tired of revolutions or political activism or any of that stuff.
I'm going to, Mohammed, just change it for a little bit because you had mentioned there was, well, both of you and Ned, everyone has actually mentioned it, is that there was no culture outside of, you had the Muslim Brotherhood and you had Mubarak's party. But Amira, you had actually started contributing or helped found a new party. And so there was this sort of excitement of, okay, maybe we can do something here. There is a bit of hope. And you had formed the Social Democratic Party, or you had helped form it. What did you notice in that experience? Were people receptive to it? Was there a little bit of direction, a bit of...
That's an excellent question, Anne-Marie. To be honest, there wasn't a complete political void, Mohammed. We still had Hizb al-Wafd, we had the old left that still was around to a certain extent. So there wasn't a complete political void. However, these political parties were less resilient than the Muslim Brotherhoods, that's for sure. Throughout the history, they were not able to continue with the current setup that the regime had put for them. So creating a new party, like we did after, which there weren't only Hizb Masih Demokrati, the Social Democratic Party. There were also Al-Adl, there was also Al-Hurriya. All these parties were created during that time, but the people did not want to join. They didn't want to join. They didn't want to help. They didn't want to. It was very hard to. It was almost like pulling teeth. I'm sorry to say it. To convince them to get out in the streets and decide to do things. I mean, to make a difference. And that was hard. It was hard because you didn't have any financial backings. The only financial backings you would have had, like Hizb al-Hurriya, were either going to be a businessman that was wealthy enough to back you. Otherwise, the financial backings were very limited and very few to come by. So a lot of it was built on volunteering. Not everybody wanted to volunteer. Very few people volunteered. Even those who wanted to see a different Egypt didn't do anything. And that's where the real mistake came, because people were too used to having things come to them. So the movement of so moving from I do whatever the government tells me to do to let me help create a government, that jump was very hard to make, because people are not used to it. They don't understand what it means to have a political party. Even those who participated in Tahrir during the first revolution, a lot of my friends, the ones who were politicized and the ones who did go to Tahrir, did not join any political party. They did not contribute in any way, shape, or form towards the creation of new governments. Hizb Masih Demokrati, the Social Democratic Party, to a large extent, did a lot in that period. We actually had one of the prime ministers come out of the party. But regardless, what I'm trying to say is it was extremely hard. It was to create the party, to convince people to start either joining or helping was very, very hard. And that's why the political void continued. And that's why the whoever was able to regain power after that did it easily. It was a piece of cake to them. It wasn't very hard because a lot of people didn't want to I think Egyptians were too either believe that joining a political party or helping a political party meant corruption of some sort, and that's what they equated in their head. And so they thought, things were going to happen on their own, and that's not how it works. You have to build something first.
I mean, political cultures or cultures of participatory democracy take a long time to instill in groups of, in societies. So I think, you're absolutely right, Amira. But I think that there's also another point, and again, like I'm not very knowledgeable. You both will know a lot more than me. But the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, they basically fulfilled. My understanding is they fulfilled the whole of the welfare state in the years and years of Mubarak's neoliberal regime that was taking more and more away from people. I mean, who had the blankets? Who had the schools? Who was doing the basic socioeconomic work, filling the hole where the state was failing? And that was the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, in a lot of places. So you can understand the journey into recruitment quite simply from a political party that's actually doing the social economic work and providing actual real material goods and needs for people on the ground. And so I could imagine it must have been really like not just pulling teeth, but it must have been almost impossible to suddenly have that culture where people are going to trust not just that this party is going to do anything, but to understand how to participate in it and also what the stakes are. I mean, why would people trust that they're not going to get arrested the next day? Like, to be able to build that trust that you really own the political culture was always going to be a long time coming. But I absolutely commend, you, Amira, and other people who gave it your best shot, because I think, that's a really, really important historical piece of work as well.
I'm just going to take it to the point just to kind of move it ahead time-wise. Amira, you're saying, it was almost next to impossible to try to convince people to join these newly created political parties in the aftermath of the ousting of Mubarak and in this political void. We move ahead, we have elections, the first, we could say, democratically held election for the country. And then we have, of course, the Mohamed Morsi, who comes up the winner of the unofficial representative of the political party of the Muslim Brotherhood. Are we surprised? Do we feel like this was all for naught? All the fight, not fighting, but all the protesting, all the hopes to come to this point? Even as an outsider, I'm wondering, Nadia, you were back in London, but you're watching this as well. What did everyone think?
I mean, I didn't know what to think. By that point, I feel like I had abdicated my any kind of expertise from the ground. So I didn't know what to think. I didn't know whether this was an opportunity for the Muslim Brotherhood to kind of shoot themselves in the foot and get it wrong and get themselves out, and that people would, that this would be that they've been wanting to get into power for 70 or 90 years or whatever. And but my Western perspective was like, well, maybe they should be in power for a bit because then they'll shoot themselves in the foot because they can't do all of these things we want them to do. Having said that, I'm very aware that for people who have any kind of belief in especially civic and political freedom, this was terrifying in Egypt. So I have to step back from this one because I wasn't there on the ground to see how it felt and whether this was something that had to be fought against or let fail by its own terms.
I think to Amira's point, in a way, the Muslim Brotherhood had a huge unfair advantage against any other political actor in this scene. They know how to organize, they know how to recruit. They were actually allowed to run elections with backroom deals with the Mubarak regime, and to win 10, 20% or 5% of the parliament or whatever. All these things were intentionally engineered, but that gave them a front row seat to how to win elections, how to run an election machine. Al-Wafd party, obviously a very historical political party that has existed for a very long time and also knows a little bit about organizing and running for elections and things like that. On the other hand, you have complete newcomers like the Salafi party, Al-Noor Salafi party, that was basically just a religious movement on the streets. And then all of a sudden, comes 2011, 2012, they decided to flip the switch and become a political party. And they have this huge following among all those Salafi clerics and people who follow them in many places. And they were just second to the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliament. I think they took 25% of the seats or something, which is huge. All of a sudden, they just came out of the blue. And I think, again, it was a very unfair advantage that these powers have ahead of any newcomers. And I think some kind of political engineering somehow should have happened to allow new parties to develop and grow and build their ability to organize politically. I think the Egyptian people, regardless of class, regardless of geography, had a huge appetite to participate politically and socially. I wouldn't put the onus on the Egyptian people, they didn't want to participate or they don't know how this works or how that works. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis were recruiting people like a hot knife through butter, day in and day out, and they knew how to do it. And yeah, funding is a big problem, but again, all these are questions that have to do with you don't have a history of knowing how to work with people on the streets, and that's why you were eviscerated in the elections. And the political activist energy was just going to the streets; it wasn't going to elections. And they didn't care. They thought politics as a morally unnecessary thing or whatever. They had a lot of high hopes, but you needed to win elections, you needed to win seats, and that's sort of what happened. So,
I have to. I want to add something to this. Before the presidential election, where Morsi won, there was also before that the Majlis Shab. I don't know what the equivalent is, the Senate, or I don't know. And that election was a huge success. By the way, a lot of parties from new parties had seats in that. There was a lot of hope in that one. More hope than I would say later on in the presidential election, because that Majlis Shab was I think the best we've seen. There was people from all sorts of parties, from different parts of the country, from different backgrounds. It was very balanced. For once, it was actually one of the best results we've had. And then came, of course, the big presidential election where we had to restart again, all from scratch. In all honesty, that presidential election, I don't think anybody had a doubt in their mind that it was going to go one way or the other, in the sense that again, let's see who started. There was, first of all, there weren't only two people that presented themselves. There were more. It came down to two at the end, Shafi and Morsi, and Shafi still had the marking of the old regime, and people wanted something to change. And of course, you didn't really have a choice. In all honesty, if you wanted to choose between the old and Morsi, and you wanted to try something new, what were you going to choose? Morsi, because there wasn't a third person. There wasn't a person that didn't have either or. And so I think in some ways the election was kind of the results were going to be, to a certain large extent, obvious to a lot of people. I don't know how.
You're right. And on the presidential election note, there were several candidates who belonged to the revolution, who were fighting each other and who were running against each other in that election, which resulted in this runoff between, Shafiq and Morsi, instead of uniting. Because in my view, the real political spectrum that was happening in Egypt immediately after the revolution was not about right wing or left wing, or was not about, more taxes or less taxes, or socialism versus capitalism. I believe it was oscillating between the military / regime and the Muslim Brotherhood. Those were the two forces of the political spectrum that were defining everything, defining the entire scene. And you're going to do something. You're either going to help this or go against this. And you needed to form a third alternative to crush that spectrum. And I think there were several unnecessary political battles, assuming that we're in a politically ideal environment. We're like, we have this party, 5% talking about center left, and then far left, and then center right. It was not there to begin with. It was like, the real question was, are we going to have a new political sphere, or are we going to inherit the old political sphere? Yeah. Are we going to are we going to be free, or are we going to be not free to operate? And I think that just consumed a lot of energy. Of course, later on, the Muslim Brotherhood governed in a very partisan way. They allied with the Noor Salafi party, and that took them even further to the right, and created all the political mess that we all know. So
we won't be able to talk much longer, because I know everyone has things to do, and we can't do that all day long. But I wanted to just take it to the point where now we're looking back 10 years. I know, Nadia, you were there at the very beginning, but you were there at an important part, sort of what unraveled all the dreams and hopes for the country. Amira, you still go back quite often to the country, and Mohammed, you left the country since 2014, I believe. 15, sorry. So you were there right after Morsi was, quote unquote, ousted, and Sisi was put in place. So you've all kind of have still a connection somehow to what's going on. Looking back 10 years and looking today, are you all happy you were there at the start? Do you think that another time is going to come again? Because as they say, as Nadia, you've pointed out, revolutions and, political activism and, a country doesn't sort itself out after a year, 2 years, 5 years. It'll take time, but has the time come yet, do you think, that to undo what's been done or to move forward? It's a bit of a loaded question, but I'll let each of you kind of unpackage it as you want.
I honestly don't think it's going to. I don't think we're going to see the same type of revolution as we saw in 2011, 2013. I think what we're going to be seeing is, with time and the development of I don't know, the Egyptian economy, we might see different parties come up, and we might see a kind of a more balance in, let's say, Majlis Shab or wherever in the government also. At some point, today, maybe not in 10 years either, to be honest. Maybe in 20 or 15, I can't really tell. Today, neither the people nor the economy nor those who were involved in 2011, 2013 capable or able to go do it again. I do think that the development will be a natural development of a normal country. We'll develop this sense of, okay, let's develop other things. Let's make sure that we have enough education and good health. Let's create this balance again somehow. And how that will develop, I don't know. But I do think that it will happen at some point.
Okay, maybe we'll go to Nadia.
I think the first part of your question, were you happy that you were there? Yes, and I wouldn't change it for the world. I'm definitely very proud to be part of that moment in history. I think, I again, like I said, I am not there and I'm not involved. I think I would measure the situation, and this kind of, I guess, speaks to something that Amira just said. I would measure it based on very kind of crude indicators, to be honest. With a country that has such a high population of poor and uneducated, in a really basic sense, like people without basic education, like Egypt. I would look at the basic socioeconomic indicators, like, are people fed? Can people get enough to eat? Do they have roofs over their heads? Rather than the kind of political and social rights in terms of oppression. Because sure, in 2011, like Mohammed pointed out, like, people were burning the police stations because that was the crux of where the symbol of how people had been, oppressed day to day. But if everyone was living at a higher, standard, what tends to happen is people tend to tolerate social oppression and lack of freedoms because they have their needs catered for by the state. I mean, that's not always the case, but I think that would be the case. I mean, again, the answer is I don't know, but that is one thing that I would look at. So if I was trying to measure what, I'm very interested in this concept of tipping points. Like, what is the tipping point? I think we would have to look at that. Is it today? Are people, which people and which groups of people and which strata in society and which parts of the Egyptian population are worse off in terms of their basic needs? And that might give us an indicator of, when things might change again in terms of just answering the question about an upheaval. Having said that, though, I think since about 1979, there have been people saying it's getting so bad in Egypt, something's going to happen. It's getting so bad. There are books and books and books that have been written about this, and nothing, and quote unquote, nothing happened in terms of a big kind of showcase event like it did in 2011. And then in 2011, it did. So who knows? Also, who knows?
Okay. Mohammed will give you the last go at it.
Yeah, I agree 100%, obviously, with what Nadia and Amira said, and the huge amount of uncertainty trying to predict what's going to happen, because we don't have a successful track record of predicting anything is going to happen anywhere, and who could predict where societies are headed or what people are going to think about later on. I remember a dear friend of mine used to say that the revolution in Egypt was like a revolution of the mood, or a saurat mazag. It's like people just woke up and they were fed up or irritated, and no one could explain the Egyptian people. I don't think it's a uniquely Egyptian thing. I think it's just overall it's just very difficult to predict where things are headed socially, or where societies are headed, or whether revolution is happening or not. Or if you read Obama's new memoir, and the very few pages that where he talks about how they handled the uprising in Egypt, I mean, there was just a lot of mythology. For example, that the Egyptian people are just very quiet and nothing's going to happen. And Mubarak was telling Obama, you don't know the Egyptian people. The Egyptian people are very emotional. About none of that was true. And he was ousted a few days later. So there's a lot of mythology that goes into trying to explain how a particular group of people are going to behave or something. But I think also an interesting point that Nadia raised, which is something I've been thinking about recently. What are the indicators that we want to use to really measure or to salivate after? Like, okay, this is going to make me happy that Egyptians are economically better off. Or I don't care whether they're economically better off, but I want to see a new government every 4 years just because it looks nice. But has not improved the actual livelihoods of people on the street. And I think, to Amira's point, I think probably the Egyptian government right now, under Sisi, they're a little bit more vital than Mubarak was economically. They're trying to do certain things to affect the overall direction and, industrial composition of the whole country, or to dig up new sources of wealth, looking at natural gas or investments or things like that. And a lot of initiatives that really never happened during Mubarak, or weren't happening with the urgency that are happening now. If this was happening by a democratically elected government, a lot of us would be really elated and happy. But, our concerns may not be the concerns of the majority of Egypt. So I don't really know personally. Was I happy? I was extremely happy to be part of this. I mean, obviously, no question about that. At the same time, 10 years is really a very small figure in a nation's history. I think things unfold over a long period of time, and no one has the power anymore, not even Sisi or a single government, to really decide where the entire country might be headed or how things are going to unfold, especially in a very, very volatile climate globally now, politically, and all the conflicts and wars, especially going on in the Middle East right now. I think as an individual, I'm really powerless in front of all these forces. So.
Well, I just want to add to something to the whole economic thing. I don't know if anybody remembers when the last years of Mubarak, the economy was going very well for a lot of people. The economic indicators were really, really high. So it's not a question just about economy, because people were not, I mean, the social, even the middle class Egyptian was living well. So it was
really.
Yeah,
really?
Yeah.
But you're measuring on like economic indicators based on like GDP and things like this, right? But that's not. I guess that's not what I mean. So you might be totally right, and I don't have an understanding of that. But I guess what I'm talking about is like does the working class have more cash in their pocket?
Today, a lot less than then, yes. Then it was this whole economic opening, this capability of buying US dollars in the market and not having to do it secretly. I mean, in the sense that the currency was quite floating. All the normal economic indicators that we're talking about today, yes, they were there. So it was not just economy. I think the major issue was at the time was the police and the how people were being treated on the street. That was the issue that really made people mad. Otherwise, it wasn't. I don't think they had that in their heads about Ousting Mubarak in specific. Regardless, this is another issue and this is another topic, and I won't. Well, I'm not going to get into that right now. But again, like Mohammed said, we don't know how this can what would be the triggering point or what would be the tipping point at all. It could be. I mean, if they do not focus on health and education, that's going to be a problem. If they do focus on health and education, the change in the people and the normal change of how societies grow and develop will happen with time. It won't be a revolution in the sense that people go to streets, but it will be just a normal evolution, not a revolution.
That's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and a special thank you to our guests. That was Mohammed, Nadia, and Amira. You can always catch our previous episodes and all our features online at theafricareport.com. Now, if you enjoy this podcast, do rate and review us on your favorite platform. For the Africa Report, this is Anne-Marie. Thanks for listening.